Okay. Anyway, every once in a while, I just need to remind you guys that I really don't take myself too seriously. I love what Mandino talks about in Scroll 7, that man is most comical when he takes himself too seriously. So anyway, having some fun this morning, just thinking about ways to change up what you're accustomed to, what you're used to. If you watch anyone that's way too polished or way too invincible seeming on here, you are in for a treat, because I very much am not. But it's one of my favorite things about getting to do what I get to do. Thanks, Crystal. I appreciate that. Okay. It is not easy for me to hide. I was like, how far am I going to have to duck down? Fortunately, my desk is, I've got a stand-up desk and then a monitor that's on an arm that I can raise up from there, so I don't have to lay on the ground. But it is typically very, very, Lisa, come out wherever you are. Polished. That's a good one. Nice, Miriam. Love it. Polished. I'm going to borrow that one too. Love it. All these name brand awareness pieces. So as an update from last week, I've put the eye patch away. It's right here. It's accessible to me, but the eye is doing better. Now it's not it used to be the whole outside half of my eye, but now it's just a little bit on the bottom. So it looks a little weird from certain angles, but doing much better. Thanks for everybody checking on me and seeing how I was doing. Peekaboo. Love it. Welcome. Super excited to be with you today. We've got a bunch of, I wonder if you guys can even see that through my blinds. It's snowing out here. Yeah, the camera doesn't really do it justice through the blinds that I've got, but we've got a fair amount of snow coming down. I can't see the mountains today, but I love a day like this. Keeps you focused on where you're at and what you're doing. It's also a nice day to go watch a movie, which I might do later tonight. So, okay, but I digress. Today we're talking about a tough one. Part of why I wanted, thanks, Mama. Part of why I wanted to start out a little goofy is because what we're going to talk about today is one of the hardest things to bring our funny bone to. And if we do, it's more one of these, like, because it doesn't really feel good. And we're going to be talking about our systemic mind. And not necessarily our systemic mind as a general concept. I'm talking about the sabotaging elements of our systemic mind. And to do this, I'm going to challenge myself, because I've done this before on here and it can get way out of hand and go way too crazy. I'm going to challenge myself to see if I can give you a really simple math lesson in terms of the dimensions, okay, that your brain functions on, okay? There are 3 dimensions for your mind. Meaning these are 3 mathematical dimensions. Let me make sure I don't cut this off there. There we go. There are 3 mathematical dimensions that our brain processes life on. This is the basis of the habit finder. What we're measuring are these 3 dimensions in your inner world, which is like looking in a mirror at yourself. Then we're measuring these 3 dimensions in your outer world, which is like looking out a window at your life and the structure, authority, other people, everything else. To be able to get an opportunity to understand this, I want to make sure you have context to how this works, okay? The top dimension, okay, in other words, the most valuable dimension is intrinsic. The intrinsic mathematical dimension is infinite. It is most closely associated to a human being, or love, or priceless, beyond value, beyond worth. Those are the intrinsic things in our life. Not a human being that we see for their role that they do, or what they can do for us, or anything that's doing, but the being part of that human being, that where love and passion and all those things come from. That's the intrinsic dimension. That's, generally speaking, that's the feel-good stuff. That's the intrinsic side, the bigger picture, the sentimental, the really the things that are most important to us in life when we're in a good, conscious, clear state. That's the intrinsic. Okay, I want to make sure everybody's following me. So feel free to throw tabs out there, our safe word on power sessions, for those of you who weren't here for our discussion of how important it is for us to have a safe word on here, because I can go on tangents all the time. Feel free to throw a tabs out there if you need it, but I'm pretty sure this is simple enough, okay? Intrinsic, human being, And I mean like a priceless human being, not the idea of a cashier or even just a mom. And I don't mean just a mom, but that's a role. That's not who someone is. And so we're talking about the love, the priceless, the passion of a singular human being. Then we come to extrinsic. Okay? Now here's what's interesting. In the intrinsic space, it's infinite. Okay? Again, I want to make this super, super simple, but it's important for you to be able to grab onto how powerful when we get to systemic, why it's so difficult to be able to handle it. It's infinite, and any part of it is also infinite. Okay? Meaning the pricelessness of a human being is not lost just because they lost an arm or because they have a disability or whatever the case is. They are still a priceless human being. They are still an intrinsic concept, even if certain parts of it are missing, because any part of it is also infinite. Okay? I'm losing anybody so far? Oh, welcome back, Miriam. Welcome back to the States. Okay, so then we come to the extrinsic, which is also infinite. There's an infinite number of extrinsic things, but in and of themselves, okay, they have a specific definition. They have boundaries. They have limitations. There's an infinite number of extrinsic things in our lives. Okay, this is stuff. Okay, that's the easiest way to sum up the extrinsic. It's the stuff in our life. It's the things that are measurable, contrastable. When our brain is employing its extrinsic side, it's practical judgment, common sense. And I understand there's plenty of you out there who get frustrated with other people who don't have common sense, but I mean generally accepted common sense, not necessarily what you feel like is common sense. That's an important difference. But the extrinsic is the stuff. There's an infinite amount of stuff, but if you took any element of that stuff, it would be defined. It would be, you could box it up, so to speak. Whereas intrinsic, there's an infinite number of intrinsic things, but any of those intrinsic things are also infinite in and of themselves, okay? You don't have to grab onto this perfectly. I just want you to feel the difference between these three areas, okay? So this is what's priceless, beyond worth, love, a human being, seeing their infinite worth. Then the extrinsic is the stuff. It's the practical, okay? It's the logical. It's the things, measurable, contrastable. Then we come down to, and just because of the point I'm making today, we're going to write it in red. Then we come to the systemic dimension. The systemic dimension is neither infinite in the number of things that there are, or infinite in any pieces of those. The systemic dimension is totally singular. It either is or it is not. Okay? This is typically structure. So you've got intrinsic, which is a priceless human being's love, extrinsic, which is the stuff, practicality, and then you've got structure, which are like laws and rules. And as we'll talk about today, ideas. So intrinsic is infinite. It's beyond tangible. Extrinsic is tangible, and systemic is also not tangible. Systemic is just things that exist in your mind. Like laws, like the Declaration of Independence is not tangible. It's not a real thing. If you actually show it to me physically, that's just paper and ink. But the power it possesses is systemic. It's an idea. Okay? Now, the sacrifice put behind that, okay, there were extrinsic wars that were fought and battles that were fought and ideals that were represented extrinsically that were surrounded by the intrinsic idea of patriotism, of what this country represents and why we came here to the United States in the first place. So you've got the systemic laws of the Declaration of Independence, for example, the extrinsic battles that were fought and the actual piece of paper it was written on, and the intrinsic sense of patriotism that made that worth it and the passion for it. So just a really simple example to get an idea of what these three areas are, okay? Now, I just want you to feel the difference. This is the highest level of consciousness, intrinsic. Extrinsic is practical judgment, common sense, and systemic is singular, all or nothing. Okay, it's a light switch, on, off. That's all there is. Okay, but all three are important. All three create balance, and all three require alignment for our lives. For example, I think we talked about this last week. Mandino said that with love alone, I can succeed. Well, love is intrinsic, but he wasn't saying you just need the intrinsic and you don't need the extrinsic and the systemic. That would be ridiculous. Just as battling for the freedom of this country required all three, battling for your freedom in life and what you want to create is also requires the alignment, all three. But the reason why Og said with love alone is because that is the intrinsic, meaning with that in place, you can always have the proper perspective and priorities around the extrinsic and the proper perspectives and priorities around the systemic. Here's the challenge. A lot of entrepreneurs, and especially in corporate America, have been taught to flip these. That if we can take care of the systemic first, what's the plan? What is the law? What are the rules? What's the system? That then I'll be able to do the system and I'll be able to feel the result. So we're going backwards. And then we wonder why it's so difficult to sustain the system, which is the least fruitful mathematical property in our lives. When the focus is the system, and we're hoping the aftermath of what we do by focusing on the system will hopefully create the outcome of the intrinsic, we're leaving our life to chance, and we're leaving our life to a limited, repetitious, boring, mundane approach to things. So here's a little insight before we dive into the terrors of systemic thinking, because there's a lot of benefits, okay? It does help us understand things clearly, on, off, singular, clear, laws, rules, either is or it is not, tremendously beneficial. But we can also see where the risk of getting caught in systemic thinking can create problems, especially when intrinsic priorities and extrinsic priorities are at play. When we're trying to force systemic ideas on these, we fall short. Okay? Let me draw this out to what we're talking about. Oh, the point I was going to make. If any of you are exhausted, burned out, finding less and less passion in what you're doing, anxiety, depression, all different things of a non-clinical nature, okay? And I've talked about that extensively on here. So if you want to talk privately about that, if there's something you don't agree with, please let me know. But I've talked extensively on here about the differences between what I mean by depression and clinical depression, okay? But with that said, if you're having challenges and you're not quite sure you can sustain what you're doing, or you can't get going, or whatever the case is, 100% of the time, 100% of the time, these are out of alignment in terms of what you're valuing. Your brain is over-focused on something systemic, which is creating less focus or less value on the extrinsic, which is robbing you of the value that you should be leading with in the intrinsic. Simply put, if you're losing passion, life is feeling repetitious, boring, mundane, you're fatigued, whatever the case is, it's because these are out of order. When you take your habit finder, we're pointing out the mathematical order of these things, and you rank them based on the value you perceive based on the words and phrases that are there. Keep in mind, those words and phrases are EEOC certified, meaning they are certified by one of the most stringent regulatory agencies in the world, saying that they transcend race, gender, and religion. It's amazing, okay? So you've got those words and phrases, but what they're representing are these three values. And if you rank them out of order, we know the risks of systemically thinking before intrinsically thinking, or extrinsically thinking before intrinsically thinking, and so on and so on. So when that bar moves to the right or to the left, it's showing that where we want to be in alignment is out of alignment. Now, that's not necessarily bad. It's very human to have these, because there's multiple different dimensions of these, okay? There's 6.4 quadrillion variables when we really get into the mathematics. But again, you don't have to worry about that stuff. Just know that if you're having challenges that you're not quite sure how you can get over, or you're having success that you're not quite sure you can sustain, be sensitive to, is love and the pricelessness of a human being leading the way. Period. You start at the top. Is what you're trying to accomplish becoming more important than the people involved? Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. Just as I said that, many of you went right into a systemic rationalization. You went into a systemic dichotomy. Is what you're trying to accomplish becoming more important than the pricelessness of a human being? A systemic response to that would be to say, I'm only going to care about the pricelessness of a human being. Then our conversations get less clear, less focused. Then we start rationalizing different things. We just want to feel good rather than be productive, and rather than we just want to transform rather than transact, and we get messy. And it may feel better at first, but again, we're using this as an excuse to not focus on these things. So let's dive into the systemic dilemma, okay? But if you ever need a realignment, Crystal, you nailed it, start at the top. And then allow that to guide the other two. We don't disregard the transactions. We don't disregard the tough conversations. We don't get rid of the uncomfortable part of growth and getting out of that zone. We just do it from this place first. That if we've got something we need to do, and there's a certain way we're supposed to do it, that we're going to consider it in context of the pricelessness of ourselves and the pricelessness of others to be able to align those things. Okay? The rest of our discussion will be mapped out as such. Systemic, singular line. Singular line. Everything that we're going to talk about from here comes from the fact that it is either this or this. Check or X. It's either all or nothing. It's either life or death. It's either right or wrong. It's either black or white. And so on and so on. That is the systemic dilemma. There is no gray area. Now, let me pause for a second if anyone has any questions about where we were just a second ago. This is not so that you can master axiological mathematics, okay? That would take a lifetime, okay? I've been working with it off and on for 15 plus years, and it still is so amazing to me in terms of how it works and what it allows us to measure in the habit finder. Because again, as we talked about when we first launched these power sessions and made them available to all of you for free here on the Facebook page, it was letting you know that the reason Habit Finder is as effective, but as difficult as it is because we are going to the source of your reality, your thoughts. It's the source of the decisions you make, the emotions you feel, the actions you take, and ultimately the results you create. And the more in alignment we are, the better, okay? But systemic, this is a go-to for entrepreneurs, okay? We know that over 90%, that's 9 out of 10 of you. It's actually 92%, but 90 is a nice round number. So, and it's weirder to say 9.2 out of 10 of you, okay? I'm not quite sure who the 0.2 is, okay? But in terms of 90% of you are at risk of this, okay? So 90% of this being your default. Meaning when your brain is processing your life, over 90% of you are at risk of defaulting to a systemic dilemma, to something you're considering, something you're wondering about committing to, something you're wondering how to get done. It goes into an all or nothing systemic battle, which intrinsic is a gray area. It's infinite. It's all of this. It can have a little of this and a little of that. It can have a little of this and a little of that. Extrinsic even gets to cross over to different realms, but when we get into systemic, it's singular. It either is or it is not. Now, this comes from a wonderful gift. Now, for those of you wondering about this, you'll want to go to your habit finder and you want to look at structure. It's the last section in the outer world, the last section as you scroll down and review your habit finder. And if you look at the third measurement down that says analytical, and your bar moves to the right a little bit or a lot of it towards obsessive. That's where over 92% comes from, is that particular measurement. It is the analytical obsessive. That is the obsessive. That is the number one contributor. It's not the only one, but it is the number one contributor to your very active mind. A mind that goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. When this measurement's there and I'm reviewing your assessment with you, more than likely I asked you, or one of my specialists asked you, does your brain ever shut up? What do you do to quiet your mind? Because it's always going. And if it's going that fast, and we're living in, I was reading a book the other day, I've shared this before, that said for the first time ever, we're living in an over-communicated society. So we have these very active minds and getting overstimulated. And that book was written in 1981, by the way. So kind of scary to think about where we're at today. They go on to lay out how many pounds of newspaper are printed every day, how many words of books are written every year, and there's no way how much time it would take for us to even keep up with 1 year of that kind of communication. And then you think about today, it's crazy, it's wild, okay? So our 90% default comes from the analytical obsessive because it's a gift. We have very active minds, but that needs to be able to process on its simplest level possible, which is systemic. Systemic is the simplest level as possible to process a lot of information because either is or it is not. It's all or nothing. So it's not that you're a bad person because you default to systemic. It's your brain's natural reaction to having way too much to worry about, way too much to think about. And so those of you with tremendously high capacity, those of you who've been able to operate through chaos and variables and all kinds of curveballs and different things like that, it's likely because you have an incredible strength to break things down systemically. All or nothing, black or white. Really easy to sort at that point. Your brain can process a lot of things when it's in this space. I want to make sure that's supremely clear, that this is a wonderful gift, that you have a very active mind, okay? But the risk is what we want to be aware of. But the reason I want to make sure you understand it's a gift is because we want to go into risk for the sake of awareness, okay? Because risk, the whole reason for the habit finder is to approach risk as an opportunity for awareness and or consciousness. Higher levels of awareness, higher levels of ability, higher levels of consciousness, higher levels of accomplishment and clarity and speed and performance. Risk should be approached with awareness. If I didn't make clear to you that it was a gift, okay, and we're going to talk about the risk, your systemic mind would want you to believe that risk equals bad. Risk equals, in fact, the specific term that most would use, equals weakness. It is not a weakness because in terms of this systemic argument, a lot of you are going, well, it doesn't sound like a strength. My mind constantly obsessively going, crushing people in the process, all the things we're about to get into. And so our systemic mind says, well, risk is either good or bad. It's either all or nothing. It's either good or bad, right or wrong, life or death. And so risk must be bad because we're talking about being careful with it and how we need to be concerned about it. That's the systemic mind talking. We need to elevate above that into the extrinsic mind where we can have some practical judgment, some common sense around this, and then eventually be able to create enough ability that we can take it to an intrinsic level where we can use systemic to serve us and support us in structure and rules and ideas rather than have it control us as the easiest default for your brain. So it is not weakness. Risk is just awareness. The challenge of viewing it as a weakness is then we want to do with the challenge the same thing we want to do with everyone else. We want to fix. If risk is a weakness, we need to get rid of it, and therefore we need to fix it, which is exactly how we look at everyone else. Their risk is a weakness. What they don't know is a weakness. Their bad choices are a weakness, and so we need to fix them, which is one of the only options that your systemic mind can come up with. So as you start building a business, as you start leading a team, you are very solutions oriented. You're a problem solver. You have all the answers. You can shoot down ideas that would have been really bad to invest a lot of time and energy into because you could figure them out really quickly. You know what's going on with other people before they even realize what's going on with themselves because you're very active, obsessive mind. But here's the number one challenge, is that when you're dealing with people, remember the 3 dimensions? Are people systemic? Like the pricelessness of a human being? Is it even extrinsic? It's intrinsic. You are literally, when you are in this mode and you're working on weaknesses, which means it could be all or nothing, and we get into fix-it mode, and many of us on this call especially, because you guys are here to get better and better as leaders and get better and better as entrepreneurs and whatever the case is, many of you fix quite eloquently and very supportively and very graciously, but it's still fixing. Because systemic only cares about the core of it. It has no problem if you want to dress up your systemic agenda with good intentions, okay, and with nice language and decent negotiation skills. But the major challenge is you are still at your core trying to fix something that is not wrong. Because if a human being is priceless, if they're beyond worth, do they really have any weaknesses? Do they really have anything wrong with them? I don't mean this as an altruistic utopian argument, okay, of a perfect world. I mean this from the approach your brain will want to take when you let go of this, for them and for yourself. Because if it's an awareness, then we're going to want to seek to understand. We're not going to want to fix, okay? We're going to want to understand. And if we seek to understand, then we open up the realm of possibility for that intrinsic, priceless human being to feel understood. And when someone feels understood, their cooperation increases at a minimum by 40%. Their productive energy increases at a minimum of 40% by not relying on this default systemic fixing problem-solving mentality. One of the reasons, let me stop there for a second just to make sure anyone has any questions. Now remember, this is coming from your very active mind, your very brilliant mind, I might add. Over 90% of you that have the analytical obsessive measurement are at tremendous risk of fixing because you only have 2 options. And so if someone isn't perfect, then that means that they've got weaknesses and problems, and you can fix them because you've got a brilliant mind to do so. But then you'll notice that you get a lot of followers. You'll notice that you get a lot of projects. You'll notice that you get a lot of the same questions from the person that you answered that question for them a week ago. Because if you're all or nothing and they can't show up as all, then you continue to try and fix, and you're only giving them 2 options too. It's one of the reasons why I don't like what Yoda had to share. Okay? Because I happen to find trying to be one of the most beautiful things in this world. But if we're on a default of systemic, there is no try. Because that's in between, right? Well, try to take this marker from it. I mean, it's a really crappy lesson that's been taught out there in this industry. Do or do not. Yeah, I get that in terms of action, okay? That you can't think your way into the places that action can get you. But your systemic mind here is do or do not, and it assumes I'm either perfect and I'm everything and I'm all and I'm life and I'm right, or I'm nothing, I'm dead, I'm wrong, okay? Getting an opportunity to be able to look back and forth at those 2 things, okay? That's the challenge, is we either need to fix everything or we need to create problems, or it's unattainable. Does this come from people like me who feel they have to do everything themselves? This is the primary measurement. Great question, Raul. This is the primary measurement, analytical obsessive. The second one you're going to want to look at is in work, okay, which is in the second section, and it's called conscientious. It's the second measurement down, And conscientious is, for many of you, probably, I would probably guess based on this crowd, over 50% for sure. Okay, over 50% of you, conscientious is going over to the right. It's the second measurement down, to impatient. And that comes from being in these all or nothing circumstances, because people don't fit into a systemic box. Okay, that's when the systemic approach or perspective crushes people. That's when the system crushes people that are trying to grow a business. That's when the system becomes the dictation of their passion and what they can and can't do, and it becomes all or nothing, life or death. And so other people, when they get into our systemic thought processes, can't fit there because they're intrinsic. And so therefore the default that Raul was talking about becomes, well, I'll just do it myself then, because these people are not systemically showing up the way that I want them to. Okay, and that particular measurement, conscientious and impatient, what we're trying to get done is more important than the person. We're over-focused on the result. The extrinsic outcome or result is becoming more important than the person, and it adds fuel to the fire to this analytical obsessive that's trying to fix everything. So this is especially pervasive as a parent, because our kids can only be all or nothing in this space. And if they're not all, then they're nothing. Although you would never think that consciously, because you're fixing your kids is wrapped in really good intentions, really, really good intentions for them, I would hope, for most of you. And good intentions are what make it so hard to be able to recognize this dynamic, this all or nothing, right or wrong space that we get into. There are areas of our lives where we've relied on this heavily, and there are parts of it that it can really serve us. Structure, rules are really important, especially for those of us who are seeking freedom. Okay? The challenge with seeking freedom on this level is freedom becomes an all or nothing thing as well. The two most dangerous goals that any of you on this call, any of you watching this can have, the two most dangerous goals you can have is time freedom and financial freedom. Because in this all or nothing perspective, it's assuming that freedom is either the lack of freedom is total resistance, or the freedom we want is no resistance. Well, when they sent astronauts up into space for an extended period of time for the first time, what happened to their muscles? What happened to their strength? Their muscles atrophied. And they had a major challenge staying strong because they had no resistance. I'm not saying that you seeking time freedom and financial freedom on an intrinsic, extrinsic, and systemically aligned perspective is wrong. I'm just saying if you're leading with systemic, you're trying to get to a place that doesn't exist. You're trying to get to a world of all or nothing, where you have all the money you need so you don't have to do anything. And you've got all the time you need so you don't have to go anywhere. It's a world that doesn't exist. Freedom is something you want on an intrinsic level. Freedom is a feeling, not a focus. The focus is alignment and mastery and consistency and action, all of which are impossible to sustain if we're leading systemically in our lives. When we are overdosing on a systemic approach to our lives, more than likely we've suffered from a few cases of the just need tos. Because systemic is really simple. It's really easy. It's all or nothing, do or don't. And so we figure all I need to do to succeed is I just need to fill in the blank. I just need to do this. Hey, you should consider hiring us as a coach to be able to help you with this kind of alignment. No, I'm fine. I just need to blank. Okay, how's that working for you? How's making what's holding you back even simpler? And the simpler we make it, I just need to, okay, we adopt the Nike philosophy, just do it. And we're leading with that, but we haven't been doing it anyway. Now we've made doing it seem even easier, which makes us feel even stupider that we can't do it. Why would we want to torture ourselves with that? I just need to. Well, if you're already stuck in a systemic dilemma, you're just adding more fuel to the fire that's burning you alive. You're making yourself feel even dumber for not being able to do it, because now your brain has made it sound so simple and you still can't do it, or at least do it consistently. And our all or nothing brain just continues to beat ourselves up over and over and over again. Exactly. Cindy just shared what can help us break out of this in that kind of space. Start to focus on what we get to and choose to and want to, rather than what we have to and supposed to and all this stuff. In fact, if you're having challenges with that, you're going to want to look at the whole My Dreams section. My Dreams is just a romantic way of saying possibilities. And if you're building possibilities in your life that are bound by the chains of have to, should, and must, and all or nothing, and all this different stuff, that whole section, by the way, My Dreams, is all systemic. The construction of your dreams is done on a systemic dimension. But it's got to be a systemic dimension that's in alignment with the intrinsic and the extrinsic for it to actually create what we teach, and that's a worthy dream. Okay? So let's wrap this all up a little bit to make sure that this is something that you guys can use. First of all, we want to understand that you're not broken. You don't have weaknesses. That all the things creating challenges in your life are strengths. They are gifts. They are your genius that you may not be as aware of as you need to be, or you're not as conscious of, or you're over-focused on, or you're under-focused on. Your challenges are strengths that are out of control. If you view them as weaknesses, you will try to fix yourself and fix other people. And that is a really difficult business to sustain. You'll find yourself reaching levels of the company that seem like they should have been a lot easier at that point, but you're killing yourself to be at that level. And then you look at the level that you really want to be, and your systemic mind can only assume that you have to multiply the burden you're currently carrying. And that sounds exhausting. If anything, downright terrible, because we're stuck in this systemic dilemma. Let's step back from this. Let's understand and appreciate the power of systemic structure and rules. And let's step back from this and start to find the alignment of all three, of priceless human beings, the practical judgment and common sense that we can apply to our lives to serve them better and ourselves, and the structure that will help us sustain that. We lead with love so that everything else can be aligned. Action. Yes, if you're I gotta get it done, then get it done with love, with a heightened sense of awareness, that agape love we talked about. If you're I need to simplify my life, simplify it with love, with the appreciation and consciousness of the value of a human being, including you, and especially you. And be careful when we get into these all or nothing dilemmas, okay? These just need tos, this fix, this problem solve, rather than choosing to do what we should do at the base, and that's understand. Have the awareness, the consciousness to understand you. And the best way to understand you is to seek to understand others. Remember, the greatest university of you is everybody else. Now, I talked about the most dangerous, toughest, scariest dragon to slay. And it comes from all of this. Now that you've seen the impact, the claws that systemic thought can have, why it's our default, why our brain loves it, it's easiest for it to use all or nothing, because there's just two buckets to sort. And with all the input and all the data that it's bringing in, here is the number one challenge in terms of damage. Just carnal, crushing people, ruining relationships that we didn't intend to ruin, comes from this core risk in systemic. And that is the need to be right. The number one cause of divorce and destruction in relationships. Period. It's the need to be right. I've heard people argue, well, no, it's money. It's the need to be right about money that created it. At its core, it was this systemic dilemma in a relationship that should have been intrinsically focused. It's the systemic dilemma in a business that should have been intrinsically focused. This need to be right that crushes people and makes life way harder than it needs to be. Need to be right. Now, those same 90% that have that analytical obsessive, they're not the only ones, but they're the ones most prone to it, also have a challenge with needing to be right. If you have that analytical obsessive measurement and you're telling me, I don't need to be right, you're going to want to look a little closer, okay, and look a little deeper, because you do. It's just a natural reaction to the way this systemic dilemma works. Just like you can't, we'll get into this, okay? Need to be right, okay? You've got an idea. Here's the idea. We want to believe that we can discuss this idea civilly, that we can process the idea as it just being an idea. But because of our very active mind, our brilliant minds that are so active and so powerful, they end up attaching this idea to our self-worth. We've got the idea, we've got the self-worth, and now they are inextricably connected, not just by one, but it is just connected across the board. It is solid. These are major chains, okay, and locked in and reinforced and whatever. Okay, I'm trying to think of some construction dialogue that lets you know how this works. This happens at a level that we may not be aware of. Some of us, as I'm talking, are going, oh my gosh, I totally do that. Some of us are like, I don't think I do that. But you do. This is a natural molecular process for someone with a very active mind, is to take an idea, get it attached to their self-worth, and then you don't just need to be right about it, you have to be right about it. Your self-worth determines your survival. Any challenges in your self-worth have only come from compensating for survival, trying to stay alive. Okay, someone keeps telling you you're not good enough, someone keeps teaching you, whether on purpose or not, that you're not enough. You don't agree and say, yeah, you're right, I'm not enough. What your brain does is goes, well, okay, I'm enough if, and I'm enough when, and so it starts attaching to all these other things to be able to feel like it's enough. It never totally abandons on being enough, otherwise you would experience total self-destruction, okay? But you get this idea, and that the idea actually creates a physical, let me grab a better marker, actually creates a physical attachment. There is an energy exchange between your idea and your mind, your body. So now the idea is directly tied to your self-worth. So if someone challenges the idea, they're actually challenging your self-worth, which leads us to understand that we don't need to be right just on an emotional level. We don't need to be right because we're immature and entitled. I need to be right. We need to be right the way that someone who is dehydrated needs water. That's where the need comes from. That's what causes us to act irrationally about just where to go to dinner or what should be on the pizza or little things where very obsessively analytical people have very visceral reactions, whether they act out aggressively or if you're more introverted, more passive aggressively. There's a lot of different ways to do that, okay? That when this idea gets challenged, it needs to defend us because the idea isn't being threatened, we are. And this need to be right kicks into high gear. Our awareness, our consciousness goes way down. So now if you take this process, this idea attached to our self-worth and this need to be right, and you wrap it in good intentions, like the good intentions that you have for your kids, parents, and it makes it even more impossible to understand how this railroad train ends up just running people over. With your kids, it's like trying to write I love you on a Post-it note and put it on the front of a tank and then drive it at them. Because driving it at them will solve the problem. It'll help them understand what they're doing is wrong and it's going to ruin their life and we know better, but we're doing it because we care. So that's why we have the Post-it note. It's so likely that they're going to notice the Post-it note. If you're running a business and you're a leader and all you do is solve problems and fix, well, I'm solving problems and fixing problems because I want them to know I care. You're going to get a diminished result, a diminished return each time. Because what human beings really feed on an intrinsic level is feeling understood, feeling connected. And fixing and solving is only connecting on a systemic level, a singular level, versus connecting on an infinite level that can allow for a minimum 40% increase in cooperation and productive energy. If you've got a really logical mind, I keep bringing that up so that you can at least grab onto that to start to understand where your need to be right comes in. And here's the big kicker. When you need to be right, remember that scale, okay? All or nothing, right or wrong in the systemic dimension, the systemic dilemma. If you need to be right, that means that they need to be what? They have to be wrong. Rarely do we think about that. When we've got an idea that we know can help someone and we keep trying to force it, or we feel bad because they rejected it, which means they rejected us. They didn't. They just rejected the idea. But we felt like they rejected us. So then we get awkward and timid and I don't like this business. I don't want to do what I do anymore and da-da-da-da-da, because now we need to compensate for the attack on our self-worth rather than step back, become aware of this systemic dilemma, be aware of the triggers for it. Whether the triggers are certain things with your kids, certain things with your customers, certain things with your clients, certain things with your spouse. Be aware of it and go in being ready for this, and go in wanting to listen to understand, to seek to understand, to find good in everything, not just in whether it's good or bad. Find good in everything. Realize that it's not weaknesses, it's not stupidity, it's people's strengths and gifts that are out of control, including our own, that are creating some of our greatest challenges. Might relieve some of the pressure for you to be able to recognize this and dismantle it. Because when we were focused on needing to be right, what we were really doing was making sure they knew they were wrong, and we didn't even realize that's what we were doing. And we crushed people in the process. And then we wonder why they don't call us back. We wonder why they can't sustain their momentum, or why they aren't as committed as they sounded like they were, or they weren't ready, or whatever. All this stuff that then we start making really poor, limited, systemic assumptions about an intrinsic human being. This is why it's so important to slow down. For those of you that are drivers with this, if you're a driver in life, you're an extrovert in life, you go get them in life, and you've got this, especially reason to slow down in the right ways with the right tools. I can't say slow down in general because that's going to be different for everyone. That's why we coach. That's why we do so much more than just these power sessions. If you're becoming aware of this equation and you have a difficult time being able to break free from this, and you can see a tremendous benefit on the other side of the rainbow, if you will, then reach out to us. Let's talk about coaching. Let's talk about diving into your systemic dilemma and bringing your genius out so you don't have to fix your way to success, because that is an exhausting path and one that is impossible to sustain. Let's find alignment in the intrinsic and the extrinsic and the systemic dimensions in our life, because they are all important. I love that. Way more fun to crush goals than people. And there's a dance to doing that. Being over-focused on goals can make us susceptible to a lot of these different things. But then our systemic mind will think, and this happens in corporate America, I saw it all the time, we either have fun or we hit our goals. We either care about our people or we hit quota. You know, it's like a false dichotomy, a systemic dilemma. When we are in alignment, we can have all of it. We can crush goals and lift people. We can find freedom and mastery. We can create the success that we deserve to have if we understand this alignment. If this isn't connecting, but there's something about it that's eating away at you, then reach out. Connect with us. Reach out to one of my habit finder specialists and let's review your assessment. Okay? If you're not sure who that is, then email office@ogmandino.com or support@habitfinder.com. Either one. And let's talk. Let's get deeper. Let's go through this. For those of you who are already working with us in groups and individually, then break down, make things simpler on you. Because one of your mind's favorite reasons for going to a systemic dimension is to use confusion to get you into a systemic place. Because if it can make it really complex and really confusing, all the more reason to make it all or nothing, black or white, which is not a place you want to naturally live in, because the world, the beauty of it, the love, the human beings you have an opportunity to serve are intrinsic and infinite. And your primary objective should be to listen and find good and allow that to line everything else. It's easier said than done. That's why we measure 6 quadrillion variables in the way that you think, so that we can make your personal development as personal as it was supposed to be. Thanks for being with us today on the Power Session. I hope this was helpful to you. If this was a lot for you, just grab onto one thing. That's all you got to do. Grab onto one thing. We know the retention on a session like this, as with everything as human beings, is going to be maybe 10, 15%. All the more reason to grab onto one thing and see if you can explore it. And if it doesn't feel practical, doesn't feel common sensey, then that's probably because it's in an intrinsic dimension, an infinite dimension that you've got to try and feel to understand. For example, reading Scroll 2 is one thing. Hearing about the way Og talks about love, actually living it is how you actually learn it. And sometimes that can feel a little like this until something clicks. And a lot of that requires stillness and patience and a desire to love and listen and find good. Doing those things increases performance and income and objectives that you want to accomplish. All the things people are looking for, that they're focused on all these other peripheral things to accomplish. When right here is the core. That's where we teach from. So let us know how we can serve you. Thanks, everybody. Have an awesome week. We'll see you next time.